For 182 years, this historic landmark has stood the test of time. James Brown built the home back in 1817. Historians believe it's the same James Brown who served as an African-American aide to the nation's first president. The home, still on Spring Street, has survived the construction of the Holland Tunnel near the turn of the 20th century and the hordes of traffic that followed. But it's about to face another challenge, one that may be the final test of its now fragile structure. A new water main construction project commissioned by the State Department of Transportation is scheduled to begin next year.
They say that their project is within legal vibration limits, which is true, except that when that pipe rolls off the truck or the steel plate drops suddenly, we get a jolt that could snap our pins and be the end of this house.
New owner Kip Heyman is pressuring the State Department of Transportation to change the construction route from this to this. Heyman says if the state doesn't bypass the house altogether, it should pay up.
We would like direct assistance for our emergency stabilization costs if they will not change the route of the project.
The Ear Bar, one of the city's oldest drinking establishments, shares the building. Faithful patrons agree something must be done.
If this place goes down, I think it's a shame for the neighborhood, it's a shame for the city. It's a famous, great place, and a lot of people have had a good time here for a lot of years, so it'd be a shame.
But the state says it's doing all it can to be reasonable. Officials have offered to move the water main area from in front of the James Brown house to the other side of the street. They'll also closely monitor the vibrations caused by the construction. Work would stop if it is damaging the building. In addition, the Department of Transportation is requesting a level of vibration tolerance lower than that requested by the owner. But Heyman says given the state of the building already at a tilt, even this is not enough. Despite the state's position, the owner says he won't give up hope yet. On Wednesday, an engineer from the city's Landmark Conservancy is due to arrive here to conduct tests and have an estimate on how much it would cost to preserve this historic site. In Lower Manhattan, Arlene Makoko, New York 1.
The Good Day New York Ghost Unit turned up a mystery in our town at a New York landmark. They say the Old Ear Inn has a license for spirits. Let's take a listen or a look.
Downstairs, we would open for no reason. We'd go around and find out why, ask people why. Is anybody down there drinking? And they'd be no.
A feeling that things probably move around down here. That is apparently by themselves.
This turn-of-the-century house is where they say a drunken sailor named Mickey, living in a brothel, died, but now haunts the Ear Inn.
Somebody died upstairs, and to keep things quiet, they weren't kept down here for a while.
We've had all kinds of experiences with Mickey. People have seen him, felt him. He's particularly adept at making sounds.
Oh, and there's the piano. I had an impression when I came into the building that sometimes a piano is heard playing when there isn't anybody playing it.
I had an audio studio up there in the study, and for years I had a real problem with recording sounds there because I would always get extra sounds. After many years of living here, I feel that there is not only just Mickey, but earlier spirits in the house. There has been such a continuum of people that have inhabited here. And that's common to any old building anywhere in the world, I think, that you build up a reservoir of human spirit, even if it is not tangible or in any way evident.
If you're a New Yorker, then you know that this is a town of almost constant renewal. It seems as though you can't walk down any street without seeing some new construction. But amidst all of the construction are bits and pieces of our history. In this case, the Ear Inn. It's in what people in the neighborhood call WoHo, west of Houston, and it's old. It was established back in 1817 as the home of James Brown, said to be the black man depicted in the famous painting showing Washington as he crossed the Delaware. It has landmark status now and plenty of memories. This line represents where the old Hudson was?
The river was right here on the shore, and then it was extended to Washington Street.
And how close did the ships come to this bar?
Just a few paces to the corner here.
and the sailors would come streaming off to get their beer and grog. And
Let's take a look at it.
all right. Now, the first thing I want to show you is the general view of the bar up front here, which is the original restaurant. And it has a historical patina and some signs that were taken off the piers that were torn down right on the end of Spring Street. We also have an oar from one of the longboats that used to ply the river. Above the bar are bottles that were dug out of the basement. When we dug a wine cellar, we came into the bottles they used for brewing, bottling beer here 100 years ago. I want to show you the back room.
All right.
It was built during Prohibition as a speakeasy. This arch was built in the 20s, and they had a curtain that was drawn back here, and they sold their illegal liquor in the back, while the front was some legal operation. The upstairs is still in original condition from 1817, and features federal-style fireplaces and doorknobs and window sills.
Good. So and this is your apartment now?
Yes, this is my homestead.
Up here in the attic, you could see the construction of the original building. It's post and beam. They say there's not a nail in the whole building. It's all done with pegs, a form of construction that's been outlawed, they tell me, since 1835. So the next time you're walking like a typical New Yorker with your eyes on the ground, take a look up. You never know what you might see. Steve Powers, Fox News, Channel 5.
Inn, a bar and restaurant in the 1817 James Brown house on Manhattan's Lower West Side. It is typical of the many small federal-style houses that once were common in the neighborhood.
It was built at the end of Spring Street, near the river shore. The river was originally 5 feet west of the current wall. When the house was built, it was filled in to Washington Street, where the ships came for the first decades. This finely preserved federal house on Charles Street is perhaps how the James Brown house looked when constructed. It has steps up to the door and basement windows. The Ear Inn has sunk over the years into the sandy river edge. The back may have looked like this. These rebuilt federal houses on Harrison Street have a common backyard and an alleyway, as once did the James Brown house. The house has a gambrel-style roof, which is a sharp-peaked front and a low-sloping back. The original cedar shingles are underneath the current tar roof paper. The dormers are the light source for the 2 front windows. The keystone is a typical window cornice of the federal-style houses. This is a front window cover which covered the original shop window front. This is a style of protection that was put on buildings in the 1700s. This is a late version of that and said by the Landmarks Commission to be the only existing one of its kind in the city of New York. On one of its panels is painted a bird by the painter Daniel Witz in his series Bird Life of Manhattan. Now, as we go into the bar, we see the mahogany bar, which dates from the turn of the century. Behind this originally were 2 fireplaces Then there was also a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the room. In the back room, we see an archway leading to what used to be a backyard with a little garden and an outhouse and the alleyway which went south towards Canal Street. Above the bar, we note a series of bottles which were excavated from the basement. They include Italian wine jugs from the mid-19th century and bottles of the beer that was once bottled in the premises. On the tables we see crayons, which are the trademark of the restaurant now. This has been copied by many subsequent restaurants in the city. We also have various memorabilia from the Commissioner of Ports. In the basement there is the wine cellar, dug into the river edge. There's also refrigeration and kegs of beer from England and Ireland. There's a staircase which features a banister made by 2 oars of long boats from the 19th century. Now, going upstairs, we come up into the apartment living room, which is still in original condition, unaltered since 1817. There are floor-length windows, a fireplace in the Federal style, which had been bricked up but is now opened again. Above the mantel is a painting by Shari Deans of an ear with an eye and a nose and a mouth, which dates from the 1930s. Across the room is the kayak and a panel photo of the waterfront in the neighborhood in the 1940s featuring the Erie-Lackawanna ferry boat, which is now a restaurant in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Now in the kitchen, there's another fireplace, tin ceiling, and a view out into the garden. Going up the stairs, we see the hallway with a bathtub. And then in the study, we have a variety of musical instruments and workplaces. There are 2 small bedrooms, each with a dormer, and the captain's bedroom with a window overlooking the Hudson, waiting for the ship to come in. Going up the hatch, we come up to the sailor's loft in the attic with the wood beams. Going out into the back of the house, we see a clapboard back, all wooden with no insulation. There was originally the roof and the skylight over the dining room. There's been a deck built over this and garden and a greenhouse roof. The floor is a soul painting by Shari Deans.
Today, industrial buildings and factories and garbage trucks dominate the neighborhood. Only a handful of original houses survive. When James Brown built this small house in 1817 on Spring Street near Greenwich Street, the area was a rural settlement north of the city's center called Lower Greenwich. It was an offshoot of the more affluent village of Greenwich to its north. Small one-family homes lined the cobblestone streets. Some residents operated small shops on the ground floor of their homes. Within other houses lived working-class families whose breadwinners toiled as laborers and cartmen. This small neighborhood, bounded by Houston, Canal, Varick Streets, and the Hudson River, has changed dramatically since that time. Most of the small Federal-style homes were destroyed, but the James Brown house has escaped the bulldozer and the wrecking ball. It stands today, 169 years after it was built, as evidence of an earlier way of life. It is a rare survivor in a neighborhood that has changed tremendously. Who was James Brown, the house's first occupant? According to local folklore, he was a freed black slave or a black military officer who served in the Revolutionary War. He is supposedly depicted in the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. For his military service, he was rewarded with money to build the house that stands today. Before it was settled, Lower Greenwich was a meadowland that stretched west to the Hudson River. Flocks and herds grazed in the open fields, and the scent of newly mowed hay filled the air. The road to Greenwich, the present-day Greenwich Street, traversed the neighborhood, and before landfill efforts widened Manhattan's west side, it lay right along the Hudson River bank. It was the most fashionable drive of the day. Brannan's Gardens, a roadhouse at the corner of Spring and Hudson Streets, was a favorite spot to quench thirst. Pleasure seekers who thronged the road on the way from the city to Greenwich were its chief guests. A late 19th century writer noted,
"And how brave a sight it must have been when the halt for the refreshment being ended, the long line of carriages got under way again and went dashing along the causeway over Lispenard's meadows, while the silvered harness of the horses and the brilliant varnish of the Italian chaises gleamed and sparkled in the rays of the sun."
South of the area was Lispenard's Meadow, a swamp that, according to one New Yorker, was
a morass covered with a tangled growth of briars and bushes and young trees. It was dangerous alike to animals of 4 legs or of 2.
It was drained in 1730. The ditch dug to drain the water to the Hudson River became a small, sluggish stream. It was called the Canal and was on the site of what is now Canal Street.
He falls as the leaves do fall early in October.
A remaining stream still runs under Canal Street. The neighborhood's most famous house was Richmond Hill, a mansion at the corner of present-day Charlton and Varick Streets. George Washington mapped his plans here for the Battle of Long Island, and it was later occupied by Vice President Adams and Aaron Burr. It was from Richmond Hill that Burr left in July of 1804 to fight his duel on the Weehawken Heights with Alexander Hamilton. The mansion was lowered in 1817 when surrounding streets were opened. It fell into disrepair, first housing a theater, and later a boarding house, roadhouse, a circus, and menagerie. It was replaced by a row of brick houses in 1849. With the opening of the streets came the new residents, James Brown among them. A large market was established, but what residents couldn't purchase there was available from local shopkeepers. Shoes could be bought from John Fenton at 289 Spring Street, books from Sam Montgomery round the corner on Greenwich Street, dry goods from John Stillwell at 290 Spring Street, and most likely, tobacco from James Brown. Lower Greenwich remained a modest settlement, yet just a few blocks to the south was one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in the city. Rows of elegant townhouses surrounded a private park that could be entered only with a key. Facing the park was St. John's, an architecturally stunning church built in 1807 on Varick Street. After 1850, the neighborhood declined. The once elegant homes were occupied by the poor. Many blamed this transformation on the New York and Hudson River Railroad Company. In 1865, it built an unsightly 3-story freight depot right on top of the park. The townhouses were soon destroyed and replaced with factories. The well-to-do attended St. John's, but the residents of Lower Greenwich had their own church, the Spring Street Presbyterian. Begun in 1811, at the corner of Spring and Hudson Streets, it was to serve the neighborhood for more than 150 years. It was erected, said church officials, so that the people of the country could have the same religious privileges as those in the city. The church served both blacks and whites in the neighborhood. As the rural settlement grew, so did church membership. 154 years later, in 1961, the congregation was so small the church was sold and demolished. Today, the site is a parking lot. The church narrowly escaped destruction at the hands of an angry mob during the Great Abolition Riot of 1834. The pastor of the church was known for his opposition to slavery, and by 10 p.m. on a hot July night, the pro-slavery mob reached the church. Spring Street was a barricade of carts, barrels, and ladders chained together by the mob to keep police away. Stones, brickbats, and missiles of various kinds were flying from all quarters. The church doors were torn off, pews were flung into the streets, windows were smashed. After an hour of rampage, the mob was stopped by the National Guard. The neighborhood continued to flourish. The West Side waterfront was rapidly taking shape. By 1844, there was a pier at the foot of almost every street, and the once backward waterfront became an important terminus for the entire city. Hudson River sloops and schooners docked here, unloading farm produce for the markets, and lumber and other raw materials for nearby factories. South Street and the East River continued to dominate in waterborne trade, but when steam overtook sail in the mid-19th century, the West Side piers prospered. The famous Collins Line operated its fleet of transatlantic steamships from the Canal Street Pier. The Hoboken Ferry Company operated from the Canal Street Slip. Cunard steamships arrived in New York in the 1840s and sailed from a pier at the foot of Clarkson Street. This is the scene at Canal Street and Spring Street in 1861 as the New York troops embarked to sail south for Civil War. The bustling seaport was captured in Mannahatta by Walt Whitman.
Rich and thick all around with sail ships and steamships, an island 16 miles long, solid founded. The countless masts, the white shore steamers, the lighters, the ferry boats, the black sea steamers, well modeled.
Nothing could match the hustle and bustle of the waterfront scene along the West Side docks.
West Street is quite out of the ordinary. Every conceivable kind of vehicle. Dray, express wagon, mail wagon, furniture van, butcher cart, garbage cart, beer skid, beam reach. It's all there.
Later at the turn of the century, there were
sandwich in among them cabs, carriages, hansoms, automobiles. Dozens of trolley cars ran across the street to the different ferry houses. 2-car tracks ran the full length of it, and down these tracks, perhaps in the busiest portion of the day, will come along trains of the freight cars of the New York Central Railroad. No one can hear himself talk during traffic hours, except the cabbies and the truck drivers. Even they are usually purple in the face from trying to outroar the rumble.
When West Street and its docks were enjoying unprecedented prosperity, Thomas Cloke, a young Irishman from the county Wexford, came to America. Cloke arrived in New York in the 1880s near the end of the large immigration from Ireland. He disembarked at Castle Garden, an immigrant receiving station near the Battery. Cloke purchased the James Brown House in 1894. He brewed beer in the backyard, bottled corn whiskey in the house's basement, and operated a restaurant on the ground floor, beginning the house's 100-year association with food and drink. His original liquor license is now the second oldest issued in New York State. Francis Tavern received the first. The bottled corn whiskey was sold to ships at the West Side piers. The beer was served in the restaurant. It was one of many waterfront restaurants on the West Side and was closest to the docks. According to local folklore, when a ship docked, the passengers and crew would run off the ship and line up outside, waiting for an empty seat to enjoy Cloke's slop, stew, and beer. Cloke's business card claimed the business was known from coast to coast. The coasts were the west coast of Manhattan to coasts overseas. It's doubtful that the establishment was known as far east as Fifth Avenue. Unlike previous owners of the James Brown House, Cloke did not live in the upstairs apartment. He and his wife, Ellen Jeffers, lived instead in the more affluent Greenwich Village at 11 Commerce Street. A family heirloom from those early years, a clock left by a sailor as payment for his tab, is now displayed in the Long Island home of Cloke's grandson, John Foley. By the time Cloke purchased the house, the neighborhood had changed from working class to slum, inhabited mostly by Irish immigrants. Trinity Church owned most of the land, and it was leased to landlords, who replaced one-family homes with tenements. The Spring Street Church responded to changes in the neighborhood with social reform efforts that were popular at the time. A settlement house was established in a 5-story tenement on Spring Street. It contained a model flat, day nursery, club rooms, and a library. What the reform efforts couldn't solve, bad publicity could. Newspaper reports on the deplorable conditions of the slums prompted Trinity Church to sell its land for commercial use. The poor of the neighborhood were forced out of the neighborhood. The first to purchase land from Trinity was the Henry Heidi Candy Company, makers of jujubes and other sweets, which built a 9-story confectionery in 1895 at the corner of Spring and Hudson Street. Other warehouse and manufacturing firms soon arrived, and by the early 1900s, the neighborhood lost its residential character. Along Greenwich Street, the city built the first elevated railroad in the early 19th century. It was a feature of the street until the 1930s.
Don't you know I had no love?
This scene is the corner of Greenwich and Spring. The barn-like house is now the Munson Diner site. The other buildings remain.
Don't you know better than to sit out there?
With the arrival of Prohibition, Cloak leased the business to John Rolandi and retired to Queens. Rolandi continued to serve food, and like many innkeepers of the day, he operated a speakeasy in the back room, separated from the front only by a curtain. In the late 1920s, construction of the Holland Tunnel disrupted life on Spring Street. The westbound tube of the tunnel was built beneath the street. Giant ventilation towers were built on Spring Street. Tunnel construction also destroyed the last vestiges of Lisbonard's Meadow, a small park at the foot of Canal and Spring Streets. The land across the street from the James Brown house underwent rapid change. The buildings on Spring Street and at West and Washington to Greenwich Street were torn down. The horse-drawn van, marked White Rose Canned Goods, is making a delivery to the Ear Inn around 1910. These small houses, where White Columns is today, were destroyed. An empty lot remained and became a hobo jungle, or Hooverville, during the Depression. One old-timer remembers.
The shacks were pretty rough. The men used to come over here to eat. Joe the bartender would always give them food.
Today, a Port Authority building occupies the site. In the 1940s, the restaurant portion of the business lapsed. Thomas Cloak liquor sign was removed and replaced with a neon sign that said simply, Bar. It was known throughout the neighborhood as the Green Door. For the next 30 years, the James Brown House was a clubhouse for longshoremen, sailors, and printers. It was a rough waterfront bar. Fights were frequent. The walls, painted an institutional green, were covered with years of nicotine stains. The floor was linoleum, and a pool table dominated the back room. The place was filthy, says one old-timer.
Many times I walked out, I had water bugs on my coat. Used to see the other guys. They walked out with them, too. Joe, the bartender, says, "Take 'em out of here."
Joe Romano, who tended bar here for 42 years, would arrive for work at 5 a.m. By 7, the place was packed with longshoremen who'd just returned from the union hiring hall around the corner. There were always more workers than jobs. Those not hired would spend a few hours drinking and singing boisterous songs in the darkened bar's back room. At noon, the bar would close. On Saturdays, when the piers were busy, the sailors would arrive. The place was so crowded that the bar offered takeout service. 1-liter paper containers of beer were sold for $1 each, and men would buy several at a time. Several bookies held court in the back room, taking $5 and $10 bets on horses. A main attraction for the neighborhood workers was the check-cashing service offered by Harry Jacobs, the owner. Printers and longshoremen would cash their checks here, and for his trouble, Harry would receive $5 or $10 for each transaction. The upstairs apartment was in use, either as a boarding house for sailors or perhaps as a brothel. The area was divided into small rooms, each with a door and a lock. A man known only as Mickey worked and lived upstairs from the 1940s to the 1960s. He was a retired sailor who repaired radios and televisions. He was seen at the bar only to buy peanuts to feed the pigeons. He was killed crossing Spring Street in the 1960s. His ghost is said to inhabit the house. Tony, a former bartender, recalls that his father used to work on Hudson Street, and when Tony was older, he worked as a longshoreman, truck driver, and platform loader.
We were mostly Irish and Italian and Spanish, low middle class. There was one hiring boss on the docks, like the stevedore. You carried bananas, lampblack, anything that was coming from the Norwegian-American line, the Holland line, and the Grace line. We used to drink in here. It was a tough bar, tough neighborhood.
By the mid-1970s, only a few ships still docked at the local piers. The Green Door continued as a local clubhouse, offering the same check cashing and bookie services it did in the 1940s. The few residents left in the neighborhood were mostly retired sailors and several families of recent Portuguese immigrants. This was the state of the neighborhood and the house when Rip Heyman, a young Columbia student, happened upon it in 1973. He was conducting a block-by-block search of Manhattan's West Side, looking for what many New Yorkers dream of, a house with cheap rent and a lot of space.
I was going back and bugging Joe, the bartender. "Don't bother me," he would say, and he wouldn't serve me. There was only one kind of beer and 3 kinds of whiskey on the bar. But I caught the owner once, an old Hungarian man named Harry Jacobs. I kept bugging him to rent me the upstairs and told him I could fix it up. He finally showed it to me. It was filled with junk and there were holes in the roof. But he agreed to rent it to me for $100 a month.
Rip lived above the bar, painstakingly restoring the house to its original condition. He had a succession of roommates, the most enduring of those was Shari Deans, a now 87-year-old visual artist. She was the first woman in the bar for at least 40 years. The longshoremen and sailors call her Phyllis because they said her hair reminded them of Phyllis Diller's. In 1977, Harry Jacobs offered to sell the business to Rip and his roommates.
I never wanted to be in the bar business. I'm a music composer. But I thought if I didn't buy it, I'd lose my home.
With much trepidation and no previous restaurant experience, Rip, Shari, and another friend, Paco Underhill, purchased the business. A year later, Rip bought the house. Thus, in 1978, as in 1817, the owner of the house lived above the business he operated on the ground floor. Rip, Shari, and Paco washed the dishes in the kitchen, dishes the last cook had left there more than 40 years before. They removed the pool table, stripped the linoleum floor, and painted the inside. And they gave the Green Door a new name, the Inn. The house was declared a New York City landmark in 1966, and adding a sign to the exterior required mounds of bureaucratic paperwork. The neon bar sign was still in place, so with a quick stroke of the paintbrush, Rip simply blackened the ends of the B, forming the letter E. The Inn opened on Thanksgiving Day in 1977 when 100 people arrived for a spectacular feast that featured performing chefs. Since then, the Ear has become a cultural center in a neighborhood known more for its industry than its art. The Ear sponsored poetry readings and musical performances. Many well-known performers got their start or played here. The bar features a music menu from which patrons can order one of nearly 300 cassette tapes for the bartender to play. The old patrons, the longshoremen, sailors, and printers rarely come here now. The new owners could not afford to establish a check cashing service.